The surprising connections between Islam and Christianity.
That's right.
So our goal in this deep dive is basically to extract Paul Williams's most compelling insights. Everything from his incredibly personal journey of faith to his groundbreaking academic work.
Mm-hmm.
We want to give you a true shortcut, really, to understanding these complex theological and historical intersections that, well, they continue to shape our modern world.
Absolutely.
So get ready for some truly surprising facts and a whole lot of nuance. Okay, so let's jump right in. We should probably start with Paul Williams's academic initiative, the Blogging Theology Academy. What's its core, unique offering?
Okay, so the Academy, which he founded with Cambridge University philosopher Hassan Spiker, it takes a truly unique approach.
How so?
Its purpose is to teach the Western tradition. Things like logic, metaphysics, the history of Christianity, history of the Bible, even the historical critical method.
Okay.
But all from an Islamic perspective. And crucially, they do this without straw-manning it. They really engage with the material in depth.
So serious engagement.
Totally serious.
Mm-hmm.
They cover figures like John Locke, Kant, Plato, even detailed New Testament scholarship. And what's really remarkable is that students, some of them, doctoral candidates from places like Harvard, have felt genuinely liberated. Yeah, liberated to integrate their Islamic identity in this really profound academic way. It fills a space that mainstream seminaries or universities just don't occupy.
Wow, that sounds like a truly transformative experience for those students. That unique approach, it reminds me of something I've heard called a school of accidentalism. Is that a fair way to describe their goal of, really digging into the underlying assumptions of Western thought?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. It's about turning that critical lens back on the West itself, to understand its underlying assumptions rather than just engaging in, simple polemics.
Right, not just arguing back and forth.
Exactly. It's about understanding someone like John Locke or Kant in depth, properly, but always bringing an Islamic perspective to bear, drawing on that incredibly rich Islamic tradition. That kind of symbiosis is key to the Academy's work.
Okay.
Now, on a more personal note, Paul Williams' own journey of belief. It began when he became Christian in his early 20s, right? After being a secular agnostic. He describes his profound belief in God not as something based on reasons, but purely on faith. A gift, he calls it.
It's a gift.
Yeah, one that brought him what he calls epistemological and metaphysical certainty.
Okay, that sounds quite profound. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, it means this deep, unwavering conviction about the nature of reality and how we know things. A deep sense that God is real and absolutely foundational. He feels that certainty never left him.
Interesting.
And he connects this to the Islamic concept of fitra.
Ah, the innate disposition.
Exactly, that innate human disposition toward God. He suggests his Christian experience kind of activated or reinvigorated this natural inclination to believe in the transcendent creator.
So given that deep Christian grounding, how did he then view his later conversion to Islam? Was it like a complete break for him or something else entirely?
No, not a complete break at all. He really emphasizes that for him, Islam wasn't a complete revolution. It was more like a fulfillment, a development, and even a refinement of his Christian journey.
Refined?
Yeah, he uses this analogy of Islam acting as a refinement or filter for existing virtues. Like even in societies like the Quraysh, back at the time of the Prophet, you had both positive and negative elements coexisting, right?
Sure.
And Islam came to refine what was already good, to build on it.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit and move on to common misunderstandings. Starting with something really fundamental, the concept of God itself.
Right. Well, one really widespread Western misconception, for instance, is depicting God as like an object in the universe, often crudely anthropomorphically, the classic image of an old man in the sky kind of thing.
Yeah, we all know that image.
It's quite a limiting view, isn't it?
In stark contrast, Islamic tawhid, or, strict monotheism, posits God as the transcendent cause and ground of all existence, wholly beyond human categories.
Wow.
It's a truly revolutionary concept that essentially smashes these man-made idols, as Paul puts it.
That's powerful phrasing. It is. And it's worth noting, actually, that some elements within Christian tradition, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, they actually share a similar, more transcendent view of God. It's not entirely absent there.
That's a huge distinction, though, from the popular image. Now, Christian apologists sometimes accuse the Quran of straw-manning Christian theology. How does Paul Williams address that specific criticism?
Yeah, he counters that by saying the Quran certainly has a nuanced understanding, but, and this is crucial, it's not a theology textbook.
Okay.
It's not meant to define specific doctrines established by councils like Nicaea or Chalcedon, which were, pivotal in shaping Christian dogma centuries after the Quran's revelation.
So when you say the Quran is polemical in this context, what does that mean exactly?
It means it's not trying to lay out a theological textbook chapter and verse.
Yeah.
Instead, its aim is often to challenge, to sort of wake people up.
Right.
By critically addressing ideas it sees as mistaken or, going astray.
Yeah.
It's an active engagement, not a neutral definition.
Right. Got it. And it seems this kind of misrepresentation can certainly go both ways, particularly when people talk about the Apostle Paul.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. A common Muslim misrepresentation of the Apostle Paul is to depict him as antinomian, meaning he abolished Jewish law and essentially had no moral code, maybe promoting libertinism where people could just do as they pleased as long as they had faith.
Okay.
But Paul Williams clarifies that while Paul's relationship with Jewish law is definitely complex, he profoundly exhorted people to live righteous and godly lives and to flee immorality.
So not antinomianism then?
No, it's more like a form of non-Jewish law pietism, you could say, focused on living devoutly, just outside the specific framework of the Mosaic law.
That nuance is really important, isn't it? So what would you say is Paul's lasting and perhaps unintended legacy from Paul Williams's perspective?
Well, looking at the bigger picture, Paul's polemics against Jewish law, especially in his letter to the Galatians, arguably left the Christian world without a clear public role for divine law.
Interesting. Creating a vacuum.
Kind of, yeah. A vacuum that secularism and individualism then eventually filled. Now, Paul probably didn't intend this consequence. He thought the world wouldn't last very long anyway.
Right, the eschatological outlook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it became an unintended consequence of his theology. It really just underscores the importance of nuance and, avoiding oversimplification when we look at these major historical figures.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift our focus now to more modern trends and how Paul Williams sees Islam's relevance in today's world.
Right. Paul Williams observes that the West's godlessness, as he puts it, is a really profound modern phenomenon. It's a point others, like Solzhenitsyn, have made too. And he explains that Islam offers a very clear callback to belief in the Creator. He presents it as a potentially timely solution to the West's existential and social crisis.
That's quite a strong claim. Where does he see typical conservative approaches maybe falling short in addressing this godlessness?
Well, there's a certain irony there, isn't there? Conservative attempts to counter godlessness often rely on this simplistic, maybe idealized view of Western civilization.
Right, a sort of golden age narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One that perhaps never fully existed or at least coexisted with many negative aspects. Paul Williams argues that Islam actually offers a potential solution from an unexpected place for those people yearning for a more, let's say, thickly religious society. It invites serious consideration, he suggests, without just dismissing it as, part of a diversity parade or falling for the usual anti-Islamic propaganda.
Okay, what about the historical narrative around religious tolerance? That's a topic that's often, hotly debated.
Oh, definitely. And Paul Williams offers a very provocative view here. He suggests that Christianity has actually been the most intolerant religion that the world has ever known in practice.
Wow, that is provocative. What's his evidence for that?
He points to things like the European religious wars, centuries of conflict, and historical figures like Luther, who notoriously called for the slaughter of his enemies, including Jews.
Okay.
He contrasts this sharply with Islam's historical tolerance, which he argues is actually embedded within Sharia, the Islamic legal framework.
How so?
It explicitly granted rights to the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and sometimes even Zoroastrians and Hindus, allowing them to practice their own faiths, even eat pork, drink alcohol, things forbidden to Muslims.
Right.
He calls this real pluralism, which he contrasts with what he sometimes calls the West's phony pluralism, citing, for example, France's ban on the hijab. He explains that secularism eventually kind of tamed Christianity after those bloody wars of religion, whereas Islam, in his view, needs to be in the public square precisely to safeguard these rights and maintain a just society according to its principles.
So it sounds like he's saying that anti-Islamic propaganda often paints Islam negatively, but perhaps that's more of a projection, not the full historical picture.
Precisely. That's exactly his point. Looking at it more broadly, this propaganda portraying Islam as spread by the sword or inherently intolerant is often, he argues, a projection of the Christian past onto Islam.
Hmm.
The historical reality of Christian Europe's interactions with Islam is far more complex than that simple narrative allows. I mean, for instance, the Ottoman Empire had political relationships with Protestant groups.
Really?
Yeah, they even sometimes responded to calls for assistance from Protestants because the Ottomans often offered religious freedom that wasn't found elsewhere in Christian Europe at the time. That doesn't really fit the dominant narrative of an eternal civilizational clash, does it?
Not at all. Let's maybe delve into a specific historical example to illustrate this point better.
Okay, this brings us to what Paul Williams calls the deliberate forgetfulness about our Islamic past in Europe. Specifically, he talks about Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain.
Right, 800 years.
Exactly. For over 800 years, this was an extraordinarily rich, advanced, multi-religious civilization. Christians and Jews actually flocked there for learning and science. It was a hub.
He contrasts this sharply with the ending of the Reconquista under Ferdinand and Elizabeth. They introduced the concept of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre.
That sounds ominous.
It was. It was essentially a racial and religious segregation based on lineage. A horrifying progenitor, he argues, of Nazi Germany's ideology. It led to forced conversions, expulsions, purges.
Chilling.
Absolutely. And he notes the term Reconquista itself is really an ideological proposition because the Christian Visigoths who preceded the Muslims in Spain, they were also conquerors and originally considered heretics by mainstream Christianity. So these historical blame games, they're socially and historically constructed.
That's a chilling historical echo, isn't it? Really highlights how these narratives shape our present. Okay, let's pivot now to a more contemporary issue, the question of Muslim integration in the West.
Right. And the first thing Paul Williams points out is that the question of integration itself needs, well, deconstruction. Its meaning is often vague and quite loaded.
He points out the, frankly, alarming opposition to the Muslim presence in Britain today, framing it partly as a matter of sheer ingratitude.
Ingratitude? How so?
Well, he explains that many Muslims, or their parents and grandparents, were explicitly invited to the UK in the 1960s and 70s to rebuild the country after WWII, working in vital industries, the National Health Service.
Okay.
And now their grandchildren face this rising opposition. He sees this as part of a broader macro movement of rising right-wing populism across the West. And he reminds us, something often forgotten, of the millions of Muslims who fought for the West in World War II, and the symbolic gesture of the Regent's Park Mosque in London, which was actually given by Winston Churchill on behalf of a grateful nation to the Muslims for their service.
Wow, I didn't know the specific detail about Churchill. This certainly connects to broader societal issues, doesn't it? It's not just about immigration per se.
Absolutely not. Looking at the bigger picture, Paul Williams argues that neoliberal capitalism is likely a far greater threat to local culture. Think McDonald's everywhere, declining birth rates, fractured families, than Muslim immigrants are.
Interesting perspective.
He emphasizes that community relationships, just like individual ones, are fundamentally a give and take. They require mutual respect and contribution from all sides.
That makes sense. Let's shift now to some more personal insights. What has Paul Williams learned, or what does he appreciate from other faiths?
Well, he shares his profound appreciation for the Psalms in the Jewish Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. He describes them as incredibly beautiful, the prayer book of the church, historically. And furthermore, he expresses a kind of nuanced respect for monasticism, even though it's not seen as divinely authorized in Islam.
How does he square that?
He highlights how the Quran itself, in a particular verse, Quran 5.82, implicitly praises monks and priests who are humble and not arrogant. He says he's actually met figures like that who, he feels, would genuinely listen with their hearts to Islam, suggesting they embody a true seeking of God, regardless of their specific tradition.
That's quite generous. Now, flipping it around, what about Islamic teachings that Christians perhaps often overlook or maybe don't fully appreciate?
Yeah, one key insight from Paul Williams here is that Islam's deen, which means religion, but also a complete way of life, encompasses all of life. It gives faith a crucial public role for divine law.
Unlike the vacuum left in Christianity you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. He emphasizes that from an Islamic view, God, as the creator, knows best how to organize societies for genuine human flourishing. For example, through things like the prohibition of interest, riba, gambling, alcohol.
Okay.
This holistic and social dimension of faith, he argues, is largely missing in Christianity today. He argues that Islam offers a unique and, importantly, scalable alternative to just crass consumerism and materialism.
Scalable meaning.
Meaning it's designed from the ground up, embedded in its source text from the very beginning, to structure a whole society, not just individual piety, unlike perhaps later extrapolations or adaptations in other faiths.
That's a significant difference. Okay, let's maybe do a few quick takes based on Paul's perspective. Rapid fire. Is religion declining due to bad leadership?
No, he believes religion is actually booming globally and atheism is on the retreat.
Okay. Is technology a bigger threat than ideology today?
No. Paul emphasizes that underlying ideologies are what shape how we use and are affected by technology. So ideology remains the greater concern for him.
Got it. Should interfaith dialogue focus more on finding truth or finding common ground?
You'd say both. He points out the Quran says, speak to the people of the book in the best ways, find common ground, but also speak the truth. It's not an either-or situation.
Right. And finally, true or false. Most people reject religion due to emotional reasons, not purely intellectual ones.
Yes, he says that's correct. And he adds there's actually scientific research to back that observation up.
Interesting. Thanks for those quick insights. Let's turn back to the personal side for a moment. What was the hardest part, the biggest challenge, for Paul Williams personally, about converting to Islam?
Yeah, he describes it as a real existential challenge, identifying with what is often, let's face it, a despised and misunderstood minority in his own country, the UK.
That must have been difficult.
Immensely. He realized the stakes were bigger than he realized.
Yeah.
He lost some very close friends, sadly, and had to accept that he would be misunderstood by many people. His journey, he says, involves constant learning and this ongoing unveiling of misconceptions, both his own and others.
And what about his daily habits for keeping faith alive?
He points primarily to praying 5 times a day and reading the Quran. He says if he stops praying, it's like the spiritual current gets switched off. And congregational prayer at the mosque, praying with others, for him is a particularly positive and uplifting experience. His favorite surah, or chapter, is 112 Al-Ikhlas.
Why that one?
He cherishes it for its incredible precision theology, its concise beauty in defining God's oneness, though he does acknowledge, that one's favorite verse often changes depending on life's circumstances.
Of course. It's powerful to hear about that personal commitment. Now, let's unpack a trending topic you sometimes hear about. The so-called Islamic dilemma argument, often posed by certain Christian apologists. What exactly is that argument?
Right, this is what Paul calls an old canard, basically. A tired, discredited argument that keeps getting repackaged every few years.
Okay, what's the claim?
The claim is basically that the Quran tells Christians and Jews to follow their own scriptures, right? And the implication they draw is that the Quran must therefore endorse the current versions of the Bible and Torah that Christians and Jews have today.
Ah, I see the supposed dilemma.
Exactly. But this is largely based on a misunderstanding, Paul argues. He explains that the current paradigm in serious Western academic scholarship, he mentions Nikolai Sinai from Oxford as an example, focuses on intertextuality.
Intertextuality, meaning?
It means the Quran retells biblical stories, but not just by copying them. It does so by actively correcting, adding details, or sometimes flat out denying elements found in those previous scriptures.
Can you give an example?
The key example is Jesus' crucifixion. The Bible is quite clear that he was crucified. The Quran is equally clear that he wasn't, stating quite enigmatically it was made to appear to them that he was.
Wow, that's a direct contradiction.
It is. The Quran, in this view, acts as a mu'min, a kind of quality control or guardian over previous revelations, confirming what's true and correcting what's been altered or misunderstood.
So are there specific historical or textual details within the Quran itself that challenge this dilemma argument directly?
Absolutely. Paul points to subtle things, like the correction in the story of Joseph.
Yeah.
The Bible refers to the ruler of Egypt at that time as Pharaoh. But that's historically anachronistic for the specific period Joseph is believed to have lived. The Quran, interestingly, uses different, historically accurate terms for the ruler in that era.
That's fascinating detail.
It is. And it's also worth noting, as Paul does, that modern Christian scholarship itself largely acknowledges that the Gospels are not direct eyewitness testimony. They're generally seen as anonymous, second-generation texts written decades later.
Okay.
So Paul Williams critiques some Christian missionaries for often operating under what he calls discredited and discarded paradigms, essentially being 100 years behind the curve compared to contemporary academic scholarship in their own field.
That's quite a strong statement about the state of some popular apologetics, then. So if we broaden the discussion, how did the Christian Bible itself historically develop, and how does that contrast with the Islamic understanding of the Quran?
Yeah, that's crucial context. Paul stresses that speaking of Christianity in some single essentialist sense is misleading. Historically, there have been many Christianity.
Like what?
Well, the earliest forms included Jewish Christians, often called Ebionites. They followed Jewish law, were strict monotheists, actually much closer to Islam in some ways. Then you had Gnostic Christians, Marcionites, who created early canons with very different ideas, like two different gods.
Wow, okay.
And critically, none of these early groups had the 27 books of the modern New Testament. That Christian canon developed very slowly over centuries, with quite blurred boundaries for a long time. You can see this in texts like the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, a major early Bible manuscript, which actually contains books that are not in modern Bibles, like the Shepherd of Hermas.
So I mean, much more fluid process.
Definitely. Now, in sharp contrast, Islam conceives of a single revelation given directly to specific prophets, like the Torah revealed to Moses, the Quran revealed to Muhammad, the Injil or Gospel revealed to Jesus. This was understood as direct divine revelation, God's literal word, not an inspired human list of books, compiled later, like the New Testament, which wasn't even initially seen by Christians as being on the same level as the Torah.
Big difference in concept.
Huge difference. Consequently, the Quran's polemics, its arguments, are seen as all-encompassing and constructive. They're not narrowly refuting one specific version of 4th century Nicene Christianity, say. They're critiquing core theological differences that apply more broadly.
Such as?
Such as, for example, the Quran simply telling people, don't say three regarding the Trinity. Or consistently calling Jesus the Son of Mary, which Paul sees as a deliberate replacement critique of a creed that calls him Son of God.
Interesting use of language.
Very deliberate. The Quran even uses different names like Yehud and Nasara, often when critiquing Jewish and Christian practices or beliefs, but people of the book when inviting them to common ground. It's nuanced. And a verse like Quran 2.137 is seen as a powerful, direct counterpoint to that whole Islamic dilemma argument.
What a truly fascinating journey this deep dive has been. Paul Williams's insights have really illuminated the intricate connections between faith, history, and cultural identity.
Yeah, it really has.
It powerfully reinforces the value, I think, of looking at these complex topics with real nuance and multiple perspectives. We've explored everything from historical pluralism, modern societal challenges, and the very evolution of religious texts themselves.
Absolutely. And looking at this more broadly, maybe a final thought for you to consider is how our understanding of history and the fluidity of identity itself continue to shape our present and our future. You know, how might a deeper appreciation for these nuanced, often overlooked connections between different traditions actually impact our ability to address the existential and social crises we face today?
Right.
And what role might unexpected solutions, maybe from unexpected places, play in navigating our increasingly complex world? Something to reflect on.
Definitely something to reflect on. I encourage you, our listener, to mull over these insights shared today and maybe continue your own deep dive into these profound questions.